welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Gyo Kim. On the heels of U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to South Korea and Japan, North Korea fired a number of missiles, including an apparent intercontinental ballistic missile, marking its 17th show of force this year. And both the U.S. and South Korean governments are assessing North Korea will likely conduct its 7th nuclear test soon. Today we'll discuss these and more.
We condemn the DPRK's multiple ballistic missile launches. These launches are a violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions.
In the studio with me is Robert Gallucci, distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University. He was U.S. Ambassador at Large and Special Envoy for the U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Gallucci also served as the North Korean chief negotiator. Also joining me is Scott Snyder. Mr. Snyder is Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the studio. Really good to have you both today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So first of all, Ambassador, North Korea fired a number of missiles right after President Joe Biden wrapped up his visit to South Korea and Japan. A lot of people have been expecting this to happen. So do you think this means North Korea did want to get some attention from the U.S. side?
I took the North Korean ballistic missile tests as more of the same of what we've seen over decades before, that the North speaks in a number of different ways, and one of the ways they speak is with tests of their military capability. And for the President of the United States to show up in Northeast Asia on the Korean Peninsula, the North Koreans will comment on it, and their comment is, as usual, we have the capacity to do harm, we have a military capability, we can deter you, we can manage security issues, etc. And all the usual in terms of a North Korean message. I didn't see it as anything terribly unusual.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Snyder, North Korea fired different kinds of missiles this time, including ICBM. Do you think North Korea wanted to show off that it has capability to attack South Korea as well as the United States?
I think it's a reasonable supposition that that may have been the intention behind the different ranges of the tests, that the ICBM was aimed as a message toward the U.S. And the shorter range missile tests may have been aimed at South Korea.
Ambassador, you earlier said this latest test wasn't that different from the other previous tests, but the way they waited until President Biden left, did they wait, actually, do you think?
In fact, that's a fair question, and I do not know the answer. I do not know whether they planned on doing it sooner, could not, and postponed it, or whether they wanted, for some reason, we can imagine a show of respect, but I doubt it. I just don't know if there's a message in there for us. I think the basic message is the missile test itself, and that is, I think, as Scott said, that's a message to the threat that they pose both to the United States directly through ICBMs and to those neighbors in the region, beginning with the Republic of Korea.
Yeah, so maybe what's really interesting about this is that President Biden did speak directly to North Korea during the trip. He said hello, period. and the North Koreans chose not to respond verbally or to send any gestures, but rather to take some actions. And so I do think that that is maybe indicative of where North Korea seems to be at this point, in that it doesn't seem like they're really open to a conversation.
Meanwhile, President Yoon ordered measures to ensure the U.S. extended deterrence commitment to South Korea. And according to South Korean officials, U.S. and South Korea's defense chiefs did agree to further strengthen the combined defense posture and further reinforce the U.S. extended deterrence. Ambassador, at this stage, what would be the appropriate measures from the U.S. side in order to ensure the extended deterrence?
I'm sure this was part of the president's visit to shore up that deterrent, that extended deterrent to our allies. Certainly Japan and the ROK, and also Australia, to make clear that there should be no ambiguity. The conversation that has been going on inside security circles about the president's words on Taiwan actually bear upon your question as well. The question of whether America's presence in the Asia Pacific can be counted upon by its allies. And the United States, in the form of the President of the United States, even with words which he insisted were intended to convey nothing new, conveyed again then the strength of the American extended deterrent, even to a country that's not a treaty ally, even to a country that some question has the status of a country. So certainly for the United States, the alliance with the Republic of Korea, the alliance with Japan, the alliance with Australia, all these are central, and the verbal communication of that is essential. Yes, to just say one other word here, we will, I'm sure, with South Korea, look for opportunities to exercise together, to do other things that enhance or point to the capability of our forces acting together if they needed to. But this is a time in which the subject that you raise by using the phrase extended deterrence is on the minds of everybody in the security arena.
Right. Mr. Snyder, President Yoon has been really focused on this U.S. extended deterrence commitment. What can South Korea expect from the U.S.?
Well, so far what has been promised in the joint statement is participation in this extended deterrence strategic dialogue, and also references to possible more active presence of U.S. strategic assets. But I think that, you know, while Yoon and Biden are really trying to show a united front and show the cohesion of the alliance, this is also an area where I think that there is probably a rather dynamic discussion, because South Korea, in some cases, may look for things that the U.S. is not willing to provide in terms of commitments or signals. And it is an area where we also know there are South Korean public expectations and pressures that have been gradually ramping up over time with regard to exactly what does South Korea do while the North Korean nuclear capability continues and endures now for over 15 years.
And some analysts argue that if there is stronger response from the U.S. and South Korea toward the North Korea's provocation, it could give even more reasons to North Korean people to go further with its provocations. Do you agree with that view?
Well, I'm one who believes that the North Koreans have already set their course and they know what they intend to do, and the signals that they have sent are that they intend to do what they're going to do regardless of what the U.S. and South Korea do. And so I don't think that there is necessarily a response on the U.S. and South Korean side that is going to particularly trigger any different North Korean response. It could trigger possibly a kind of heightened North Korean response, but actually the greater risk is on the downside in terms of what North Korea might perceive from too weak a response from the U.S. and South Korea.
Ambassador, your thought about this?
I want to embrace ignorance here, and my own ignorance, which is to say I don't know what the leadership in the North, what Kim Jong-un has in mind in terms of the ultimate development of its nuclear weapons capability, and particularly its ability to deliver those nuclear weapons with ballistic missiles, and particularly intercontinental range ballistic missiles. I don't know where this is ultimately headed. I do know, though, that the American military establishment, along with the ROC and the Japanese and others in the Asia-Pacific region, are watching very carefully. And I don't think that the North Korean moves will be left unmatched. In other words, I think there will be reactions in either declaratory policy, cooperation between the U.S. and the ROC, exactly the kind of thing that the North Koreans most bitterly complain about. They're likely to see more of as a result of this behavior.
Both the U.S. and South Korean governments assess North Korea's seventh nuclear test could be imminent, as it was confirmed North Korea has been testing a nuclear triggering device. Ambassador, will this test take place?
And whenever we see activities around the tech site, we imagine that test is possibly imminent. It's true that, and we ought to put this in some context, that countries with nuclear weapons have an establishment that produces those weapons who like to test components of the weapon or a weapon at full yield. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is some, if I'll use this word with quotes, pressure coming from the nuclear weapons establishment in North Korea for additional testing. Obviously, the significance is not only in the confidence they would have in the weapon, but also in the political statement, because a nuclear weapons test, for some at least, is a bit more provocative and dangerous than is yet another, an 18th ballistic missile test, right? This would be something different and something more provocative. So I don't know what the North Koreans have in mind. I do know that we'll be watching very carefully, and I would imagine particularly the establishment will be looking, the national security establishment will be looking with our allies for ways of reacting that demonstrate our willingness not to be intimidated, but to respond in some way.
But if they do test the seventh nuclear test, it does really give them leverage for future possible negotiation. It's not deniable, is it?
I'm sorry. I understand that argument. It's clear enough, and I'm not surprised you're making it. It's never been appealing to me. Yet another nuclear weapons test. The first one, yes, they become a nuclear weapons state in a de facto sense, not a political sense, but a de facto sense. But yet another test, we know what happens in these tests. We know the components, particularly if they have multi-stage weapons, if they have indeed developed thermonuclear weapons, then there are components they would want to test, particularly the primary. And if they're trying to figure out how to fit this weapon to the nose cone of a ballistic missile, there are more things they want to do in terms of size and weight and other parameters of the weapon that they would want to manipulate and they'd want to test to make sure they work. So this all makes, in the world of nuclear weapons development, sense in that sense, wholly apart from the leverage which they could imagine they would have in negotiations. I don't think another test gives them more leverage, actually. We understand that they have nuclear weapons. We understand they probably work. We understand they don't have the credibility of, say, the nuclear weapons of Russia or China or the United States, but they have nuclear weapons. They don't need to do any further to get that leverage.
Mr. Snyder, so even if they do test the seventh nuclear weapon, it wouldn't have as much as impact when they did it for the first time. Do you agree?
It probably wouldn't have as much of an impact as the first test necessarily, but it doesn't necessarily mean, Ambassador Gallucci has laid out a set of technical rationales for why North Korea might do this. And earlier he provided context for the broader environment, but I think we've got to go back to the context. There's an open breach in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a heightened Sino-US rivalry. We just had a UN Security Council meeting where Russia and China voted not to condemn a missile test. Will a seventh nuclear test by North Korea change the calculation in the Security Council? If not, then the North Koreans probably see an open pathway to move forward with whatever testing they may need to do. And it really puts a burden, I think, on the United States and South Korea in particular as to what tools are available to respond in the absence of the availability of the UN Security Council tool.
Then what I'm curious about is how will China respond if the seventh nuclear test happens?
Well, China would be tested most by a seventh North Korean nuclear test in terms of how it deals with the Security Council. And I think that a lot of people probably maybe have been counting on and hoping that China would come back into alignment with the US at the Security Council in that event. But I think that the basis for having that hope or expectation has been declining persistently over time, over the course of the past 2 years. And it's not, I don't think that it's guaranteed that China is going to change its position.
Ambassador, you earlier talked about UN, how China vetoed
Yeah,
new UN sanctions.
I have to say, for me, the way I took, Scott, the way I took the vote, it was Russia and China colluding and deciding that the main game right now was in Europe, and they wanted to demonstrate that the United States could not, as it has in the past, look to China for, quote, help with Pyongyang. That right now the issue that's in front of China and Russia is America's support for Ukraine's resistance to the Russian invasion. And China is still standing with Russia. And what we just saw at the UN was a manifestation that even the question of how they look at and we would look at them looking at North Korea will be viewed through the lens of the close ties between Russia and China over Ukraine. This is, I think, was a Ukraine vote, not a North Korea vote.
Secretary Blinken, in his latest speech, he said, well, the speech towards China, he said North Korea is still the area where US and China can cooperate. Is it realistic or?
United States and China's view of North Korea and its activity have much in common. There's a similarity, but these are not congruent interests that motivate. China looks at North Korea, at least in part, as a buffer state, and it needs its survival, and it also needs for the United States not to be given reasons for deploying additional military or naval forces to Northeast Asia. So there are these things that I think fall into Beijing's calculations. That means, though, that when we do not have a crisis in Europe in which China has associated itself with one of the belligerents here, the only belligerent there, then we can look to China to be helpful, as we have in the past. And we have some reason to believe that on occasion the Chinese have been helpful. And it's partially because the North Koreans have done things that have annoyed, and that annoyed is in quotes, it's more than annoyed Beijing. So I don't think we take the vote as a representation of a fundamental change in Chinese interests in having the situation in Northeast Asia managed in such a way that it does not become a legitimizing factor in America's military and naval presence in the region.
Anything to add?
I would say that the geopolitical lens through which China looks at its interests as related to the Korean Peninsula has enlarged. And so for the US and China to cooperate on North Korea, it would be necessary for Biden and Xi to talk and agree to carve out North Korea as an interest that they share that is separate from the broader competition. And my assessment of the likelihood of that happening right now is that it's low.
Ambassador, what will be and what should be the U.S. response when North Korea's possible nuclear test take place?
I think the United States has to continually cultivate its alliances in the region. This is the basis for America's policy and the support for its interests in the region. So that I think there has to be no ambiguity, or there has to be everything done to prevent ambiguity from arising over America's commitment to its allies. That extended deterrence that you referred to before needs to be firmly reaffirmed. We may need to do that in a more manifest physical way. Indeed, as I said before, even with some things which we know annoy the leadership in Pyongyang, but they need to be reminded, not only are we trying to reassure our allies, but we're also trying to deter a potential adversary. And they need to understand that we are intent on doing that.
Well, I think the extended deterrence agenda is the portion that the U.S. and South Korea have under their control to be able to project to North Korea, and it's reasonable as a response, but we're still looking for the ability to turn off North Korea's testing and to prevent North Korea from continuing on this military development emphasis that they have been holding on to for so long. And that, I think, those manifestations of military development are where the perceptions of risk are generated, and why North Korea remains such a big challenge, because it means that their threat capacity is growing.
Do you think this provocation cycle will continue for a while then?
Regardless of what happens, I think that in order to get back to any kind of dialogue with North Korea, it's probably inevitable that we will face some kind of crisis. That's been the pattern, especially with conservative administrations in Seoul. And the question then becomes, what will be the shape of potential interaction following that crisis?
And Ambassador, I know you don't like to guess, but I still have to ask you.
No, look, a crisis is always possible in Northeast Asia. We'll just start with that. After that, I would say that both the DPRK and the USA are busy right now. The DPRK, if my reading is leading me in the right direction, is very much focused on the pandemic threat in the North, as well they should. We are very much focused on Ukraine, as well we should be focused. So this is not an ideal time for, at least in the American administration, to launch a new diplomatic effort aimed at solving an old political military problem. There may come a time when we can refocus a bit and take account of what's happening in Northeast Asia and try to find out what audacious means when used by a South Korean president. So I hope there's going to come a time when we can re-engage, but we may be going through some difficult times of signaling, like through ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons tests, and sanctions, et cetera, or exercises.
North Korea is not stopping from advancing its missile and nuclear programs and going according to their own schedule and pace. And the questions remain until when this will continue and what will happen if and when North Korea does test another nuclear weapon. Ambassador and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.